Live for God Studio Productions.
This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
This is one of the most frustrating times of the year for a lot of people. When you get into the holiday season, it is a difficult time for a lot of people because so many things happen at this time of the year. Having been in the ministry for about 132 years now, one of the things I can tell you is that more people deal with more issues and conflicts and problems during this time of the year than any other time of the year. There are more suicides committed in the month of January after the holidays because of the overall stress and how things just seem to just spin out of control. And in all of that, God is still on the throne, but why does it happen and what can we do about it? Many of you are facing a holiday for the first time with a whole different thing that's happened in life. You've either lost a loved one or you've got new loved ones in your life, or you've got a new job, or you lost a job, or you've been diagnosed with a disease, or somebody that you love has a disease. And there are things that are happening during this time of the year that bring in such incredible stress and difficult times. So let's take a look at the whole concept of this and of how we deal with it, and what does God, the gift that God gives us, how do we take that and apply it during this time? There are two significant things, and today we're going to look at Bethlehem, the gift of Bethlehem, because there are two significant, actually there are three things that Bethlehem represents in the Bible, and we can draw some conclusions for our purposes today to discover this idea of what God brings to us through Bethlehem. Bethlehem represents loss, and it represents conflict. It also represents blessing in the story of Jabez, but I'm not going to get into the story of Jabez here. I want us to look at the issues of loss and conflict, and how do you handle loss, and how do you handle conflict during a difficult time of the year, especially this time of year. Well, the history of Bethlehem is a history that reveals loss and it reveals conflict over and over and over again, but two specific things that I want us to talk about. The first is loss. Genesis 35 tells the story of Jacob, and it starts with verse 14. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it, and he also poured oil on it. This was when Jacob wrestled with God at night. Do you remember that time? All right, this is what it's talking about. And Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel. And they moved on from Bethel, and while they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't be afraid, for you have another son." I don't know, that ought to make you afraid, but anyway. In verse 18, as she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Benoni, but his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day, that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. Now, the spot is still marked out as the grave where Rachel was buried. It's about a mile from Bethlehem. And anciently, it was marked by a monument which has long disappeared. It's been torn down. Terrorists have done things to it. But the present tomb is covered by 4 large pillars surrounding it, and it is an Islamic site. And it's the site, they call it the site of Rachel's tomb. And it's kept in remembrance by united traditions of Jews, Islam, and Christians, although Islam claims it as their holy site. And it is protected by United Nations, but not very well, and it's still there. So we know the site, we know the location. But interestingly, the loss of Rachel marked a turning point in Jacob's life. There really wasn't much more to his life after that. We don't really discover much about Jacob. Sometime after that, his son Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery, and Joseph eventually becomes the prime minister of Egypt, which God used to save thousands and thousands of lives, and the lives of Jacob's family during that horrible drought, which led to Jacob's family moving to Egypt. which eventually led to the enslavement of the Jews for some 400 years before Moses led them out of captivity. But in general, it appears that Jacob just kind of lost the spark from his life when Rachel died. There just wasn't much more to his life. He just kind of lost the will to live, it seemed. And Bethlehem represented a major loss for Jacob. Now, it's important to note that although we're referring to the subject of death here with Jacob, the real subject here is that of loss, any kind of major loss. The principles with dealing with loss are pretty much the same, regardless of whatever kind of loss we're talking about, whether it's death or the loss of marriage or the loss of a job or the loss of an investment, and so forth and so on. Any kind of major loss in your life that causes significant change. And in a moment, we're going to take a look at how do you deal and how do you handle loss. The second thing that Bethlehem represents is conflict. And the story is told in Luke chapter 2, starting with verse 6. Or actually, let's look at verse 1, but I want to take it through verse 7. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. And then in verse 6, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. Again, a baby being born. First, not the first time, but we just saw the baby was being born and the mother died. In this case, she gives birth, Mary gives birth to her firstborn, a son. She wraps him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And this is really, when you look at it and stand back and look at this at Bethlehem and what it represents, you see that it also represents conflict. It was a very conflicted time. And this whole story is a story of conflict. Jesus is born to an unmarried mother at a most inopportune time, while she and her fiancé were in Bethlehem to register for taxes on a night when there was no place to stay in this small village. The town was only about 90 to 100 people. So it wasn't that big. And she wrapped him, the Bible says she wrapped him in swaddling clothes, which apparently means that there was no one there to attend Mary. And so she ended up delivering the baby by herself. It's possible, although not probable because of custom and culture, that Joseph helped. But more than likely, she delivered the baby by herself. So Jesus was born by no means into a normal or comfortable setting. It was a birth of conflict. And Joseph and Mary's lives were thrown into a whirlwind of conflict. But here's the wonderful gift of Bethlehem. In the middle of loss and conflict was born the solution to loss and conflict: Jesus. In the middle of Bethlehem was born the solution to loss and conflict. And Jesus taught us how to deal with the Bethlehems in our life. You have losses and you have conflicts in your life, and you have lots of them. And if you don't, just hold on, because they're coming. You're going to be dealing with losses and conflict. There are more to come in your life. So how do you handle loss and conflict? How do you handle the losses and the conflicts in your life? And especially at this time of the year when they just seem to multiply and we become so much more sensitive to them. Let's look at loss. Dealing with loss tends to go through 5 stages. You may have heard this. The 5 stages are denial, anger, compromise, pain, and acceptance. Denial, anger, compromise, pain, and acceptance. You follow that pattern. People generally follow that pattern when they're dealing with loss in their life, when they're going through difficult times. And I've found in my own case when I am dealing with people who are going through major conflict in their life, a major loss. Just recently, I told you burying a 3-month-old baby that the father rolled over on and suffocated while he was asleep. That incredible loss is the pattern is classic. As they've gone through denial and anger and compromise and pain. And right now they're in the pain stage. And eventually, and it may take months, they'll get to the acceptance stage. And it doesn't make it any better or easier. It just means that now they're accepting what has happened, and reality begins to balance out their life. The reality against this horrible loss. That life goes on. Generally, when we talk about loss, as I said, we tend to think of death. But the principles of dealing with loss are pretty much the same regardless of what kind of loss we're talking about. And these principles of dealing with loss come from a story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Mary and Martha give us some real insight to this pattern of dealing with denial, anger, compromise, pain, and acceptance. Lazarus had been buried for 4 days. Now, assuming the normal tradition of the Jewish tradition of burying within 24 hours of death, that means that he'd been dead for probably 5 days and been in the tomb for 4 days. And Mary and Martha are going through the normal grief that one would expect for such a loss. And probably at that point we're at compromise from the information that we get from the story itself. And Jesus comes to Bethany to share in the pain with the family, to share in the grieving process. He loved this family very, very much. And as we look at the story, we see 5 things that we need to do to deal with loss. The loss in our own lives. How do you deal with loss in your own lives? Let me give you 5 steps that you can follow, 5 steps to handling loss. Number 1 is in verses 21 and 22. Believe that God can do whatever He wants. John chapter 11, look at that, verses 21 and 22. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And so the first thing that we do when there is a loss in our life that we're having trouble dealing with is to come to this point where we can believe that, God, you can do whatever you want. In spite of the things that are going through in my life, the loss that I'm going through, God, you can do whatever you want. Now, we tend to think of that negatively and reflect on it in the sense of the loss itself. God, that loss was apparently something that you wanted. And I define that as a probability. We look at it and we say, well, God, you probably wanted this child to die. Well, no, He didn't, that little 3-month-old. God didn't want him to die. That was an accident. You know, God doesn't will those kind of difficult things in your life. But they happen because of life. And sometimes they happen because of other people's sin. And sometimes they happen because of just life gets in the way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's God's fault or that God wanted it. But here's the important thing. Look at the positive, the possibility here. God, you can do whatever you want with this. And when you can take that first step in a loss of your life, say, okay, God, I'm willing to believe that you can do whatever you want with this loss in my life. You can do whatever you want. And if I'm willing to commit to that, say, God, I'm willing to let you take my loss and do whatever you want with it. That's the first step in dealing with loss. Believing that God can do whatever He wants with your loss. Don't blame God for the loss, but believe that He can use the loss. And that He can do whatever He wants with your loss. No situation is out of God's control. And when you look at the circumstances and say, well, this was obviously a loss of control, yeah, but God isn't out of control. God is still on the throne. And God looks at things eternally. And your loss is not eternal. Get this. Your loss is not eternal. Your loss is as temporal as earth is. God can do whatever He chooses to do, and God can get you through your loss because He can, because He's God. So the first step then is believe that God can do whatever He wants with your loss. Secondly, believe in God's authority over all circumstances. In John chapter 11, in the story of Lazarus, starting with verse 25, Jesus said to her, He says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? In other words, do you believe that I have authority over all circumstances? Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. That was a turning point in Martha's life. That was a turning point in the story. Because it had to come to that point in Martha's life where she believed in God's authority over all circumstances, even the difficult ones, even the pain, even the hurt, even the anger, the sorrow. God can take those circumstances and He has authority over those circumstances in our life. Loss, now listen to this. Loss is part of the process of gain. Loss is part of the process of gain. In Philippians 1:21, the Apostle Paul said it this way, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Loss is part of the process of gain. No loss is final, is the final aspect in God's plan or God's permissive will for your life. Boy, write this one down because this is good. No loss in your life, no loss is the final aspect of God's plan or permissive will for your life. When you're going through loss, that's not it. It's not over with. It's not done. It's just getting started. Believe in God's authority over all circumstances. The third step is that you can believe that God understands and senses your pain. Picking up with verse 33 in the story. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. Listen, God does not ignore your situation. God is concerned about the things that concern us. God senses that hurt. God senses that pain. God understands and He senses your pain. He senses your loss. He does understand that. He created you. Remember, the Bible says He created you in His own image. He understands. He has that sensitivity. He feels that kind of pain that you go through. And so you can mope on it on yourself and say, nobody really feels the way I do. Nobody knows what I'm going through. Oh, yes, someone does. The one who created you with those feelings understands. He created you with those emotions. He created you with that sensitivity. Instead of hurting so bad and feeling so sorry for yourself, how about starting to thank God that He made you with those kinds of feelings, that you can be sensitive, and He understands because He created you that way. Believe that God understands and senses your pain. And then the fourth thing is remove the things that block healing. In verse 39 says this, take away the stone, He said. I love that. Jesus didn't go to explain, okay, now look, this is what we're going to do. All right? Now don't get upset because it's going to be really radical. It's going to be really different. Listen, God doesn't set you up that way. God doesn't take you through a process and say, okay, now here's what's going to happen, and you can expect this is going to happen. You cannot expect that God's going to tell you what to expect. God's not going to tell you what to expect because, first of all, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, that's exactly what happens. I mean, He says, take away the stone, and the response was, wait, whoa, time out, Jesus. He's been dead for 4 days. He stinketh. And so if God had explained to them before that was, what was going on, there would have been a little problem. Oh, wait, time out. We need, whoa. I think we're just losing a little control here. We're losing our heads over this, Jesus. That's the way we think. See, we look at probabilities, we don't look at possibilities. We live in a world of probabilities instead of living in a world of possibilities. Jesus said, remove the things that block the healing in your life. Now, what kinds of things would that be? Well, things like unfair requirements of yourself. When you're going through a loss in your life, when there's an issue in your life, all of a sudden you take on unfair requirements, don't you? You put those things on your back and you say, okay, I'm going to have to deal with this. And you take on unfair requirements in your life. And you take on wrong attitudes towards the circumstances. It's like you look at the circumstances and you're so close to it that you don't really see the whole picture. You can't, because you're in the middle of the loss. You're in the middle of that hurt, in the middle of that pain. And so it's difficult to see the whole picture. It's important for us to understand that just because we're in the middle of a whirlwind doesn't mean that there's a whirlwind everywhere. It's just where we are. And God can at any moment stop the whirlwind. He stopped a bunch of storms, as I recall. In fact, we'll look at one in just a moment. He stopped a bunch of storms, and if He can stop a storm on the sea, He can stop a storm in your life. And so the loss that you're dealing with in your life is not something that's out of control, but you have to get rid of the things that block the healing. See, one of the things that happens in our lives is we're going through a whirlwind, and this is what we try to do. We try to wrap our arms around the whirlwind. That's dumb, people. That's just dumb. Tim and Charlotte and I had this conversation this morning. People are just stupid. And we do stupid things because we are. And every one of you qualifies. In fact, every one of you defines the word stupid sometimes. Admit it, you do. And if you're not willing to admit it, let me ask your spouse. Look at them patting each other on the hand. Oh, yeah. Listen, the fact of the matter is we think we're doing the right thing by trying to get control of the whirlwind. And we embrace it and we try to hold on to it, when the fact of the matter is God says, let it blow. Because eventually it will blow itself out. Oh, no, I got to save things. I've got to take control of the situation, and God says, back off. What it is unrealistic expectations of a resolution. We decide how we're going to solve the problem. We decide when the problem is going to be resolved. This is how the problem is going to resolve itself. And then we expect God to do it. Don't we? God, here's the problem. Now, here's the solution. Do it. People are stupid. It doesn't work that way. God already knows the solution. He already has the plan. He's the one that's in control, not you. He's not in the whirlwind. You're in the whirlwind. He's around the whirlwind. He's got the control. And then one other thing that happens in those times is that we have to deal with the issue of sin, particularly sin that's related to the loss. For example, let me give you a good example. Wrong handling of money when you lose money. For example, you lose your job and you mismanage the money that you have. Or you lose an investment and you mismanage the money that you have. I was talking to an investor, stock guy, just not too long ago. And he said one of the biggest mistakes that he deals with so many of his clients is when they go through a loss, they immediately want to take all of their money and put it in a different fund that isn't any safer or any better. And he says they make stupid mistakes. He said because they've got to take control. That's what they want to do. We got to be in control. And so sometimes in our lives when we're going through loss, there is sin related to the loss. Another example could be improper sexual activity after the loss of a mate. That happens a lot, particularly with middle-aged people for some reason. And there are so many things that happen in people's lives, choices that they make when they're going through the loss, and they're dealing with the stress of the loss, and those 5 things that we talked about, the pain and the anger and the compromise and all of those things. They're going through all of that, and they're making decisions out of those things, in the middle of those things. And when you make decisions in a time when you're out of control, what does that say about the decision you're going to make? How do you make the right decision when you're not in the right? So it's important for us to understand that sometimes in our loss, we're vulnerable and we commit sin. And you need to be careful about that. And then the fifth step in handling loss is seek the glory of God. John 11:40, then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Now remember, glory means the revealed presence of God. That's the concept of glory, the revealed presence of God. And if you believe what God is up to, believe that He is up to something, believe that He can take control of the circumstances, believe that He's going to do what He wants to do in and through your life if you let Him, then you can recognize that the glory of God is going to be revealed. You're going to be dealing with some issues in your life that look like total loss, absolute chaos, like your life is falling apart. And God says, let me reveal myself through this. Let me reveal my glory in the middle of your loss. Jesus talks about glory. When He talks about glory, He uses the word halal, which means celebration, by the way. The word halal for glory means celebration. And it's a way of saying that we are to celebrate the presence of God. It's not that God just reveals His presence, but that we celebrate His presence in our life. That's true glory, when you celebrate the presence of God in your life. But listen, if you're not looking for the presence of God in your life, you have nothing to celebrate, because you're not going to see it. You're not looking for God to reveal Himself, so how in the world are you going to celebrate that if you don't expect Him to show up? And yet it's during your loss that God wants to show up. Jesus had explained the circumstances surrounding Lazarus to His disciples. He explained it this way in John 11:4. This sickness, this is before Jesus even shows up now. Jesus says to His disciples, this sickness, He's talking about Lazarus, this sickness will not end in death. That doesn't mean he won't die, because he did die. But He says it won't end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. You see what God wanted to do through the issue with Lazarus? It wasn't that God wanted Lazarus to die. That wasn't the choice. What God wanted to do was work through the circumstances and through that loss and reveal His glory. That there might be celebration. And believe me, when you see Lazarus walking out of the grave, you're going to celebrate. It might scare the pee-wackadoo out of you first, but God's going to reveal something, and all of a sudden you're going to be celebrating the fact that God showed up. Now, what about handling conflict? You'll just have to wait until next Sunday to figure that out. Because I know we have a Chiefs game to go to. So if you have conflict this week and you can't wait till next Sunday, give me a call. I'll talk you through it. Any questions about dealing with loss? Everybody's going, no, we have to get home. We got to go. All right, let's have a word of prayer.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.